Rania, welcome back to the show. It's been some time. Wonderful to see you again. What did you think of Joe Biden's idea to build a pier in Gaza? Is he up to something, or is this just a piece of madness?
It's absolutely a piece of madness, George. But before I say what I think about that, I want to congratulate you on your win. I think it's not just a win for
Thank you.
you, George, but I think it's a win for Palestine in so many ways. And about the
Thank you.
pier, this is theatrics. It's theatrics because there is a famine taking place in Gaza. Children are dying of starvation. We see the images, they're horrifying. They're reminiscent of images we recall from World War II during the Nazi Holocaust. And this is intentional. It's an intentional policy by the Israelis of starvation. They're not hiding it, they are openly celebrating it. Both Israeli officials, since this genocide began, as well as Israeli citizens who are standing at the border, callously protesting the entrance of any aid because they are openly desiring the starvation of children in Gaza. And this is happening because the US government is allowing it to. And this pier that Biden has announced that he wants to build, which is going to cost a lot of money, which requires sending something like thousands of US troops to go to the coast of Gaza. One, it's going to take 30 days to set up. I mean, how many Palestinians are going to die of starvation in those 30 days? And on top of that, it is potentially placing some sort of military presence at the coast of Gaza, which hasn't really been discussed so much. But again, it's pure theatrics. All this requires to stop is a call from Joe Biden. He has, for 5 months now, entering the 6 months, refused to stop this genocide because he wholeheartedly agrees with it. And he wants it to continue. And I have no other, there's nothing else to believe about Joe Biden's intentions besides that until he puts a stop to it. So this pier means nothing at all.
Now, he did say that there would be a ceasefire. Laughing Gas Harris said it would be a 6-week ceasefire before they began killing again for Ramadan. But Ramadan just began. There's no ceasefire. What's going on?
What's going on here is that they don't care for a ceasefire because they want a ceasefire on Israel's terms. They want complete surrender. They want all the hostages to be sent back without any conditions. And they're not going to get that, especially after everything they've done in Gaza. So at the end of the day, all this talk of a ceasefire is, again, theatrics because the U.S. is refusing to place any pressure on the Israelis. And they don't even really want a ceasefire. They want a pause. That's it. They want to pause. So let's stop the genocide for a few weeks and then continue with it. This policy is so atrocious. And at this point, I mean, we can sit here and talk about the Israelis and their intentions. They have genocidal intentions. They're openly declaring it. They're openly celebrating it in very disturbing ways. But at the end of the day, again, this wouldn't be possible without the wholehearted, enthusiastic support of the Biden administration. They've secretly approved 100 weapon sales to Israel that we just learned about, on top of all the open weapon sales that we know have been taking place, on top of the fact that they just keep sending any weapon Israel wants. They have all this leverage and they're unwilling to use it. So the question becomes why? It's because they have a stake in this, George. They have a stake in this because at the end of the day, when we think about October 7th, and what took place that day, you had, as Joseph Borrell of the European Union would call it, you had the jungle people firing back at the garden. And that is completely unacceptable to the rulers of empire. And so this genocide is intended as a kind of punishment, as a sort of display of violence, to set a precedent for the rest of the global South, that if you dare to fire back at your plantation owners, at your imperial masters, this is what we will do to you. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And until they feel they've sufficiently punished the population of Gaza, they're not going to stop.
Now, you mentioned genocide. I distinctly remember the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the whole world, with the fanfare, at least in those countries that didn't suppress the news, like my own in Britain. They didn't even televise the findings of the ICJ. they plausibly, or rather, let me put it this way, they found Israel to plausibly be guilty of genocide and sent them for trial on that charge. And they gave them 4 weeks to respond to peremptory demands, which would have brought the slaughter in Gaza to a halt. Well, the slaughter did not halt, indeed, it intensified. And I've heard nothing since from the International Court of Justice. Is this an example of the rules-based order they keep telling us about?
You know, it's so interesting, George. They've spent all these decades creating this, US-led rules-based order that they've really just, weaponized against any country that dares to, stand up and really pave a path in their own interests rather than US interests. But they're willing to completely destroy it in the name of protecting Israel, in the name of protecting the sort of spear of imperialism for the West in the Middle East. And they really they've created a mockery of international humanitarian law, and they've really killed any pretense of the sort of freedom and democracy they claim to represent. And they've essentially killed these international institutions that they've created. They've also killed the UN in so many ways. Look at how helpless all of these international institutions have proven themselves to be in the face of genocide. If ever there was a reason for some sort of humanitarian intervention to prevent a bunch of genocidal sociopaths from carrying out their plans, it's now. And every legal measure, as important as those measures are to try to utilize, has proven to be a failure in the short term, at least. And I think what that demonstrates is, yes, the end of the rules-based order, but also I think the importance of resistance in the region, George, because that is all that Palestinians have right now. All they have, all that's standing between them and complete and utter annihilation is the various armed resistance movements across the countries in the region, from Yemen to Lebanon to the groups that are fighting for their own survival in Gaza.
Well, the fighting is going to continue. And by the way, if 1,000 American soldiers end up in Gaza, it will not be a comfortable billet for them, I am certain about that. So their mothers and sweethearts should know that 1,000 US soldiers are being sent into real danger and jeopardy if that happens. We'll see if it does happen. But I've got a question more difficult. It's difficult for me to ask. It's difficult for you to answer. Why has nobody else decided that force majeure was required? We've had China declare over and over again that it is completely unacceptable. We've had Russia declare the same thing. We've had South Africa. We've had the Global South declare it. We've had Indonesia, which has had a hospital ship off the coast of Gaza now for 5 months, but unable to land and bring aid to the people. Why don't countries like China, if I was running China, I would say I'm sending in ships full of aid, and you, Mr. Netanyahu, can decide whether or not you're going to fire on me for doing that. Why has that not happened?
George, I mean, I can't tell you what the Chinese are saying or what the Indonesians are saying or what the South Africans might be saying behind closed doors, or really any country. But I would imagine that what we're seeing right now is a fear of the US and Israel. I mean, the biggest armies in the world are the US, the European armies, and then Israel's a very powerful army, and they have nuclear weapons. And it is a mad dog. The Israeli leadership used to like to say we have to behave like a mad dog so the world is scared to mess with us. But I think they've actually reached the level where they are the mad dog, and it's frightening. We don't know what they're capable of doing. We see some of what they're capable of doing in Gaza. They are behaving completely irrationally and outrageously violently, and their parent, the US, is complicit in that mad dog behavior. And I think it demonstrates that as far as force goes, as far as power goes in terms of military power, The US is still the hegemon in the world. And we see how far the US is willing to go, not just when it comes to Israel. I mean, look at Ukraine. Look at how many weapons the US has been willing to pour into Ukraine, risking a potential nuclear war. The use of nuclear weapons with Russia over trying to maintain control over Ukraine and keep Russia out of the European sphere. So I think that this is a fear, that countries are acting out of fear of the US and Israel, and they can't guarantee, even the Chinese cannot guarantee that if they send a ship to the coast of Gaza to try and force aid in, that the Israelis won't fire on them. And I think that speaks to the rogue nature of both Israel and the United States at this point in history. And it is terrifying. These countries are terrifying. People around the world should be scared of these countries. They are completely illegitimate at this point. And I think it demonstrates the need for US empire to end, because this violence is the fallout of that empire. And I think in like a kind of microcosm way, the fact that Israel is really willing to take so much down with it. I mean, it's either we get to stay a settler colony or we will take everyone down with us. That's kind of the mentality they have. I think the US has that mentality, but about the entire world. And it's frightening. It's a big question. I don't know the answer to how to deal with that, but it does point to a very dark future in many ways.
Now, what did you think of the Pope's call today on Zelensky to raise the white flag and sue for peace? It's got him on the Ukrainian death list, along with me and many others, maybe even including you. What did you make of what he said?
I'm sorry to smile. It's not a funny matter. It's just so outrageous. I don't know what else to do besides laugh a little bit. I mean, it's a bit late. We're 2 years into this war, and it should have ended a long, long time ago. But I think it speaks to the fanaticism on the side of the Ukrainians. I'm not sitting here saying Russia's perfect or so like angelic, but we know that on the Ukrainian side, the US has been, and its European partners have been arming and funding and encouraging far right movements that are quite scary, quite nationalistic, and in some cases neo-Nazi. So it's not surprising at all that you would see anybody who supports an end to this war be put on some weird fascistic kill list by these people. It's very dangerous. And I think it just speaks to the kinds of forces that the so-called collective West represents around the world, whether we're talking about Ukraine, whether we're talking about the kinds of forces that they support against China, and whether we're talking about the very genocidal, fascistic, sociopathic society that is the country of Israel. These are the allies of the West, and they always have been around the world. And I think we're kind of reaching a peak here where it's just so cartoonish. Like, how much cartoonish does it get, George, than seeing the Pope be put on a Ukrainian kill list for calling for the end of a war? And it's kind of, there's a sort of parallel to what you see the Israelis do. The Israelis, anybody who calls for a ceasefire is an anti-Semite. Anybody who's anti-genocide is now an anti-Semite. I mean, it's just so ridiculous and so outlandish. And the jokes kind of make themselves.
Yeah. How will all this play in November, Rania, in your view? Joe Biden is sowing death and destruction around the world, making the United States the most hated country in the world, alongside its mad dog, Israel. He's failed economically. He's failed to heal the wounds of America. Can he seriously be re-elected at the age of 91 or whatever he is?
I mean, let's be realistic also. Joe Biden is clearly suffering from some sort of cognitive decline. It looks like elder abuse, honestly, when you see the videos of him coming out, though I don't feel bad for him because he's overseeing a genocide. All that said, aside from the personality of Joe Biden, I think what this demonstrates is that we have a two-party dictatorship in the US. And it's very clear for everyone to see right now, the sort of vote blue no matter who Democrats who want to force us to vote Democrat. Otherwise, we'll have the horrible, horrible Republicans and the horrible, horrible Trump. I mean, I don't really know how to respond to them other than what's worse than genocide? I'm not telling people to vote for Trump, but really, what's worse than genocide? Genocide is the worst case scenario to me And Joe Biden has proven that Democrats actually are not a lesser evil. They are a part of the same disgusting, imperialist, parasitic system that creates genocides like what we're seeing in Gaza. What comes November? I think that we're going to see Joe Biden lose if this continues. And even if it doesn't continue, I think at this point, people are so traumatized from seeing the dead babies on their social media feeds, and they blame Joe Biden for that even if there's a ceasefire tomorrow, there's a very good chance he'll lose because of the fact that Arab and Muslim voters matter and people who don't like genocide matter, and they're not going to vote for him. They've demonstrated their anger at him with these Democratic primaries, where in one state after another, from Michigan to Minnesota and onward, you've seen a significant number of people voting uncommitted to protest Joe Biden, and in swing states like Michigan, where he needs those votes, but he doesn't seem to care. Joe Biden, interestingly enough, is placing his support for Israel's genocide in Gaza over his own ability to secure a second term. And when that happens, they're going to blame Arabs. They're going to blame Muslims, and they're going to blame the left and probably Putin and Xi Jinping like they always do. But we will know that these parties are not different. And this, if ever we've seen a moment in history when it is time to build something outside of this corrupt, dictatorial two-party system that puts a gun to our heads every 4 years and forces us to vote for different flavors of genocide. If ever there was a moment to prove we need to build something else, it is now. And I am seeing so much organizing happening on the ground in the US to do just that. And that is what I'm encouraged and inspired by.
A very set of circumstances present here in this country, which resulted in my election in Rochdale last week. Rania Khalek, tell us finally, how do people see Breakthrough News? I'm sure many will want to do so now.
Well, thank you so much, George. People can follow Breakthrough News on YouTube and on all your social media platforms at BT Newsroom. I love the programming we're able to do. We're able to give a platform to lots of amazing people, hopefully soon you, George. And yes, please follow along. We're covering Gaza and much of the rest of the world all the time.
Lovely. Thank you. Wonderful to see you. I know that it's widely shared by the audience. I'm seeing it on my screen now. Thank you, Rania Khalek of Breakthrough News, for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.